else on another screen. So if my gaze does wander, that is the reason why. So I do apologise, but hopefully we'll get through. I've swiveled myself a little bit, so hopefully that will help. So welcome. We're going to be discussing core strand 1 today, which looks at whole setting approaches to inclusion. Just a couple of points before we get started. As you've probably heard, the delivery bits will be recorded, but the content, and it's similar to the previous National Saturdays, but the feedback and the discussions in your breakout rooms won't be recorded. Please make use of the chat function, and also, really make use of the discussions that you have within those breakout rooms. Use them to perhaps problem solve, discuss the ideas, and just make use of that. The activities there are designed to, really enhance the material on Pebble Pad. So hopefully it gives you that opportunity to discuss that. So like I said then, core strand 1 looks at whole setting approaches to inclusion. And really within core strand 1, we were looking at some of those, fundamental underlying principles related to inclusion, related to supporting learners with additional learning needs. So things such as inclusive education, neurodiversity, perceptions of disability, mindset, resilience, and aspects around that. And like I said, these are all sort of fundamental principles to understand and to think about when working with children more generally, but particularly children with additional learning needs. And if you think about, the title of the module as a whole, excellence in practice, it makes sense why we're looking at inclusion in particular, because it is particularly important and to think about when supporting learners with additional learning needs. And I know some of you have done the inclusive classroom practice module, where we looked at sort of ideas around inclusive education in some detail, but we're going to be revisiting that to recap some of those ideas, but also thinking about it with that angle of excellence in practice. Well, what does this mean in terms of excellence in practice? How can I enhance, this idea within my setting as well? And also just be mindful, other people may not have done that particular module, so it's important for them to have that sort of base level knowledge, as well as thinking about that excellence in practice idea. Laura, could we go on to the next slide? Is that all right? Thank you. So these are the aims of this morning session. And essentially these link to the sub-strands within core strand 1. So we've got a section that's around sort of the ideas to do with disability, inclusion, sameness and difference, a section on neurodiversity, and then a section looking at mindset, resilience, and linking that in with inclusion then as well. So we are going to have discussions based around all of these. So it is a little bit of sort of delivery in terms of recapping what you did on Pebble Pad, but we do want to make sure that you're getting those discussions, because we know from, your feedback on previous National Saturdays, those are the bits that you kind of see value in and really value within these National Saturdays. So we want to make sure that you've got, that opportunity to engage with that. Couple of other things as we're going through this morning session, just bear in mind the title of the module, that excellence in practice. So within your discussions, keep that at the back of your mind. How do these principles, how do these concepts, how can they be used within the setting to, enhance that practice? And just be mindful as well of the assignment as we're going through, because you probably saw from Rhiannon's really helpful explanation there of the assignment that there will be links to what we're talking about today, and how you might sort of be able to think about those within the assignment. So just be mindful of those aspects. And if there are things you think, well, actually, I would like to improve that a little bit more, have those discussions within your group sessions. Think about any ideas, and perhaps you can go away and further research those as well. So I think that's all in terms of the instructions. Can we move on to the next slide? Is that all right, Laura? Thank you. So this first section then is to do with ideas around disability, inclusion, thinking about, celebrating difference and aspects related to that. And we're going to do an activity in a little bit that kind of draws together some of these ideas. And as I've highlighted, thinks about what that means in terms of excellence in practice, and also to reflect on the practice of some of these concepts within your own setting. You may actually remember this, because it's actually a table from the Pebble Pad. It's the last sort of activity on the Pebble Pad. So you may have already filled this in. If not to worry. But if you have filled it in, we can, you may be able to go into more in-depth discussions within the breakout rooms in a moment. But before I explain the activity and you go into those breakout rooms, I thought it might be useful to just kind of recap the some of the key concepts there. So Laura, could you just take me to the models of disability slide? So the next few slides then are just me recapping some of the key things that you would have looked at, done activities on, done reading about on PebblePad. So I'm not going to go through things in too much detail, I'm not going to give you a lecture on any of these, but it's just to draw out some of the key points. I'm just conscious of time as well, because I do want to make sure that you have that time to discuss aspects within your breakout rooms. So you can use these perhaps more as handouts. So in your discussions, you may refer to these as well to, if you just need some prompts perhaps for your discussions within the rooms. But like I said, I'll hopefully just draw out a couple of the key points in relation to these. So the first one I just want to recap is to do with disability. And on PebblePad, you were asked to think about your understanding of disability and perhaps develop a definition of disability. And that was to help you sort of just gain an understanding of where your understanding might have come from. Is it to do with experience? Is it to do with any reading? Is it to do with training you might have? Is it to do from media and things related to that? We then started to look at perceptions of disability, and it was identified really that historically perceptions towards disability have been predominantly negative, things such as prejudice, oppression, marginalisation. And even though we have significantly more positive perceptions of disability today, there are still those subtle prejudices still apparent. So things like this are important to be aware of. We also looked then at the varying definitions of disability. So yes, we've got that legal definition of disability that, can protect disabled people and can, give input, help people qualify for support and things such as that. But there are varying definitions of disability. And these really sort of indicate how the ideas of disability can change, can evolve depending on different aspects. The models of disability was also touched upon within the PebblePad material. And again, this is something those who did the inclusive classroom practice module will perhaps be a little bit more familiar with. But the models of disability also have different definitions of disability as well, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But the models of disability were introduced on this module to kind of show you that there can be a framework. They can help us understand how disability might be understood. So they're a framework that can be used for understanding disability. So the medical model of disability then located disability with the individual. Okay, and the medical model of disability uses the World Health Organization's definition of disability from the 1970s when this was first developed. And that definition located sort of disability with those individual difficulties, perhaps. One of the critiques that's been associated with the medical model is the fact that it didn't sort of distinguish between impairment and disability. And that will become a bit more clear when I talk about the social model in a moment. But it is argued that that medical model of disability has had a long influential history really in our understanding around disability and has dominated our thinking about disability. In response to the medical model of disability, then, the social model of disability was developed. And this was developed by a group of disabled activists who wanted to change the way we think about disability and also wanted to empower disabled people as well. And the social model of disability then argued that, or framed disability as being caused by barriers within the environment, whether this be social barriers, attitudinal barriers, structural barriers, political barriers. So it said that, disability is caused by barriers within the environment. Importantly, what the social model of disability did was distinguish between definitions of impairment and definitions of disability. So they said impairment is to do with this functional limitation that somebody might have, but disability is caused by those barriers. And that was something that they wanted to make that distinction between when they developed this particular model. So that's just a quick overview in relation to those models. So I am going to stop that. I could probably talk for I could probably do the whole session on aspects around these ideas of disabilities, but I will stop myself. But you'll probably be able to see where there are sort of strengths and limitations within these models of disability. And you'll probably be able to see how within our society, there's probably aspects where, that reflect the medical model and aspects that reflect the social model. On PebblePad then, with that in mind, we asked you to look at how the models of disability then were evident within your education setting. Where might you see these models being reflected within your education setting? So that was an activity for you to engage in. So some things you might have had for the medical model of disability might have been to do with perhaps assessment, placement, maybe labelling. Social model then that moved towards perhaps more inclusive ideas, making adaptations and accommodations within the environment, perhaps identifying those barriers within the environment as well. And also then perhaps that change in more positive perceptions. Okay, so that's all I just want to recap in terms of disability. Laura, could you move to the next slide then, which just recaps and revisits some of those aspects around inclusive education. So this is one of the other aspects I just want to unpack a little bit. Now, I know you're aware what inclusive education is. It's something that is probably familiar to you. It's something that you're doing sort of every day within your roles, within your setting. So I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but like I said, I just want to unpack a couple of key points that might be helpful when we go into the discussions. Essentially on PebblePad then, we highlighted that inclusive practice is complex. There are various different definitions of inclusion, and often it can be left to the stakeholders, such as teachers, practitioners, and other people working within education settings, for example, to decide what inclusion is and what it means to them. And I think on the inclusive classroom practice module, something that was quite interesting and that was highlighted throughout that module, it was that inclusion perhaps was this ideological idea, that it was something they were working towards. It was this ongoing process. So that was quite interesting. But I think generally speaking, when we're talking about inclusion, it means sort of for children and young people to be educated, both socially and academically, where they can thrive, where they can progress, where they can have quality learning experiences. Often within definitions of inclusion as well, people talk about the placement of children within education settings, and that leads into sort of debates around full inclusion. And this is where sort of the idea around inclusive education becomes this contested discourse and debates arise. So you were asked to do reading on the PebblePad from Sakalaradius. I'm not sure I said that 100% correctly, but you were asked to engage in that reading. And within that reading, that looked at arguments for inclusion, against inclusion, and it actually came up with some quite interesting and poignant counterpoints, which is why you were asked to, engage with that particular chapter. And you were asked specifically to look at what you agreed with, what you didn't agree with, and what perhaps you might needed to think about in a little bit more detail. So some of the arguments for inclusion that were highlighted were around things like human rights, participation, the importance of equal opportunities for all children. The fact that, we want it to reflect society as we live. So if children are separated in education, that might mean that they're separated within adult life. So another reason for, that idea of inclusion, full inclusion in particular. It's obviously important in terms of the idea of social model of disability, removing barriers, making accommodations within settings. And also it's the idea that having this inclusive philosophy within education settings can be sort of as a stimulus that helps a richer mainstream learning environment or learning experience for all. Some of the critiques around this idea of full inclusion then are to do with, practicalities that might arise in schools. The fact that perhaps does it take into account impairments and the practicalities of impairments and supporting individuals? Issues to do with staff training experience. And other people have highlighted, well, special schools do have a particularly important role in terms of inclusion, and perhaps denying that isn't necessarily the case. So those are the for and against sort of arguments that were outlined. But like I said, there were some counterpoints that might have been quite interesting and perhaps challenged some of your thinking. So some of the things that were noted in the reading were to do with, do challenges exist in full inclusion due to poor management? Does having special schools mean that perhaps it means we rely on the expertise from those schools rather than everybody thinking about, inclusive education within mainstream settings? Because essentially the pedagogical principles might be the same. Also financially, one of sort of the counterpoints were, well, does it make sense to sort of educate everybody in one place, to concentrate resources? Is that, financially perhaps more sustainable? So these were some of the counterpoints that might have got you thinking about some ideas in relation to inclusive education. But essentially, one of the things that was highlighted was that it's important to embrace transformation, explore assumptions and practices, and to sort of continue work and develop those. And one of the things that is particularly helpful in reaching that is sharing examples of good practice widely. And that's something that I hope you'll be doing within the group sessions today. And as well, what was highlighted, that these good aspects of good practice can be within mainstream settings. And, several bits of research have highlighted that there's not one type of setting that there's not one type of setting that is the most effective form of provision for supporting children with ALN in particular. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say around some of the inclusive ideas. So hopefully that's given a recap of some of that reading. Could we move on to the next slide, Laura? Thank you. Oh, when it went over, sorry, I'll leave that bit there, if that's all right. So I'm just conscious of time. So the other ideas then that have been highlighted in that table are to do with extending what's available to everybody. I'm not going to go through that in detail because it's fairly self-explanatory, but just to remind you that you were asked to read the chapter by Florine, who identified this idea of extending what's available to everybody. And in the chapter, Florine sort of talks about supporting teachers to be able to do this, so extend what is generally available to everyone, rather than perhaps differentiate, which may differ people within that setting. And the idea behind this was that it perhaps gives new thinking towards inclusive practice. So just things to be aware of there. And actually within that reading, Florine highlighted quite a useful table to help people start to perhaps thinking about this within settings. So things you might want to be aware of, but also some of the challenges and what you might do to overcome that. So if you didn't manage to read that chapter and this is something that interests you, please make sure you go away and do that. So just a reminder of what that concept refers to. And then the final concept listed in the slide is to do with celebrating difference. So sorry, I think it's flipped back on my slide, Laura. There we go, brilliant, thank you. So one of the other things you were asked to look at and reflect upon within the Pebble Pad was thinking about perhaps a distinction between tolerating difference and celebrating difference. And again, that can sort of have a real impact in terms of excellence in practice, perhaps in the way that we're thinking about educating people within our settings. So like I said, you were asked to reflect within your school where you might see examples of tolerating difference and celebrating difference. So just a reminder that you covered that as well. So that's my delivery bit on this particular aspect. Can we just go back to the activity slides, Laura? Thank you. So in groups then, we're going to go into an activity in a moment. What I'd like you to do is discuss this table. Like I said, you may have completed this before and that may allow you to perhaps go, discuss aspects in more detail. But if you need to work your way through this as a group, please do so. But I'd like you to think about each of these different sort of concepts, think about how they lead to excellence in practice, and then think about where these might be reflected within your setting. What are the strengths within your setting? What perhaps are the areas or limitations within your setting? And then if we just go to the next slide, Laura, what I want you to focus on then is that third point here. If there are areas of weaknesses, what can be done to perhaps further develop that excellence within your own setting? And you might like to, if you get around to it, think about, well, what's the most significant for you to focus on in developing excellence for ALN and why? Okay, so you can use that table to frame your discussions. And like I said, try and focus perhaps on what you can do further to develop excellence. And it's that sharing of ideas, sharing a good practice that I hope you really get some useful ideas from here. So we're going to go into a breakout room now for about 15 minutes to give you opportunity to discuss that in some detail, and then we'll have some feedback. So if I don't know if the break do with whole school setting. So again, this is neurodiversity is sort of an idea that's kind of grown over the last few years, really, and it's probably something that you're all familiar with. And it's probably something that perhaps you're using that term within your settings. So, like I said, I'm not going to, go through this in too much detail, but it's just to draw out those key points and remind you of the reading and the activities that you might have engaged in within the Pebble Pad material, and hopefully that then will help with the discussions that you have in a moment as well. Essentially, when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're highlighting that neurodevelopmental differences are a natural part of human nature and human diversity. So while individuals may experience difficulties, they may also have superior abilities, strengths associated with conditions. And rather than being thought of as difficulties or deficits or disorders, they are a learning difference. They're different way of processing information. They're different ways of thinking, whether that be to do with taking in information, processing information, communicating information. And therefore, as educators, it's important to be aware of that and to think about how you might adapt the provision that you have and the instruction and the activities that you might have within your education settings. So the Pebble Pad sort of gave an overview into that. And like I said, you may already be familiar with some of those key ideas there. It also asked you then to perhaps think about some of the more the conditions that you might see within your classroom more frequently, and look at perhaps rather than the descriptions or the characteristics associated with those, but think about the positive descriptions for that as well. How might you think about it in a more positive way? So that was an activity that you were asked to engage in. And you were also then asked to think about how having an understanding of neurodiversity might help only staff within the setting and how it might change their perceptions, but also how it might help the learners within the setting as well, and how having this understanding of neurodiversity might support the learners too. You were also asked to engage in some reading around some of the sort of the arguments around the neurodiversity paradigm. So looking at arguments for neurodiversity and ideas around this, and perhaps some of the ones against that. So there was an article that got you to do that, and it focused more specifically on ASD. But in that article, it did highlight some fors and some against in terms of the neurodiversity. But it was interesting to know that the critiques around sort of ideas to do with neurodiversity are largely around sort of misinformation and misconceptions of what neurodiversity is. And so if we think about this module, ALN Excellence in Practice, it's important to be aware of those arguments so that you can help to change those perceptions of people within the settings, perhaps parents and other stakeholders that might be working with children. So if you didn't manage to look at that article, it might be useful to be aware of, because it may be that you can sort of help change those perceptions and ideas. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Laura? Thank you. So one of the other things that was done on the Pebble Pad, it was to sort of link sort of this idea of neurodiversity to education a little bit more specifically. And you were asked to read Armstrong to sort of help you to do that, really. Because obviously when we're talking about neurodiversity, there are implications for learning, and there are implications when we think, as a consequence of that, for education settings. And Armstrong, within the chapter that you were asked to read, kind of highlighted that it's important to respect each pupil's unique brain and to create an environment, the best environment for them to learn. And in order to do that, Armstrong came up with this idea of positive niche constructions. And this is essentially, when we kind of break it down to what it means, is about making positive changes to the immediate environment to ensure that the learning environment isn't restrictive. So it's about changing that immediate environment in a positive way to ensure that it's not restrictive for the children. And Armstrong identified 7 components to do that. And on the Pebble Pad activities, you were asked to just give a brief description around each of those, and then to reflect on your own practice and whether you're able to see that within your own practice. So, you've got things like strength awareness, so positive experiences, positive role models, assistive technology and universal design. So thinking about differentiating instructions, removing barriers so that it can be beneficial for all, things that we've already talked about a little bit. Strength-based learning strategies. So strategies that focus on the strengths of the individual rather than just perhaps what they might, rather than perhaps a condition. Looking at sort of human resources to ensure that there's that rich network around the child, and to ensure that you're sustaining those relationships in a positive way. Thinking about positive career aspirations. I know from research that that's something that a lot of, particularly people that might have disabilities, don't necessarily have. So thinking about those positive career aspirations can be really important, and reflect that within the setting. Thinking about environmental modifications, and that can extend to the whole setting rather than just perhaps classrooms as well. But those are some of the ideas that were sort of developed around the positive niche construction. So with that in mind, and like I said, you hopefully have had a chance to read that on the Pebble Pad material. Not to worry if not, you can hopefully develop those ideas within the discussions. We're going to move on then to the next activity, if that's okay. So for this next activity then, it's in 2 parts, and I'd like you to focus sort of one part for 10 minutes and the second part for 10 minutes. So in the first part, I'd like you to use your knowledge, experience and the points noted from the material, and reflect on points from the handout, which I think has just gone into the chat as well. So on that handout, there are a few questions, there are a few pointers, and I'd like you to discuss that within your groups, to look at your perceptions and think about those ideas around neurodiversity within education settings a bit more explicitly. The second part of the session, then, of that activity, I'd like you to discuss 1 or 2 of the components of the positive niche construction. Consider how they might be used to create the best differentiated learning environment to support neurodiversity, and share examples, basically. So share examples of good practice. If there's an area you think, oh, actually, I'm not sure we do that within our setting, have that discussion with the people in your group. What do they do, perhaps, that might be really good for you to adopt within your own setting. So use it as a space then to gather some, useful ideas. Like I said, it may aid your assignment going forward, but it also may aid the practice within your setting as well. So hopefully you've got the handout so you can see the 2 parts to that activity anyway from the slides, and then don't forget the additional handout for that first part. So it's nearly 10 to now. 1:45. So if we come back within 20 minutes, so around. Oh, I think you're on mute, Laura.
That helps, doesn't it? Okay, hello everybody. So what I'm going to do is I'm kind of drawing together just from this last part now. So for substrand 3, really. What I'm going to do, I know you've obviously read a lot of the resources that are on Pebble Pad, and you've obviously done a lot of reading surrounding the growth mindset, resilience element of that substrand. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of give you a bit of a summary really, to kind of support you with that part of your thought processes in relation to inclusion. So I've kind of noted down here some sort of key points really that we need to be considering really in relation to how these sort of strategies influence practice. So drawn upon everything really that Megan's been through now so far, what I want to draw down more now is thinking about, inclusion. And like Megan was saying there about Armstrong and this idea of reducing environmental restrictions, and thinking about then what role growth mindset and resilience play really in promoting inclusion in practice. So some of the key points really, now I know a lot of you will have lots of knowledge and understanding of growth mindset, one from obviously the Pebble Pad, but also massively through your own practice. And I know it's kind of been very much pushed more and more recently in developing grit amongst learners and helping them overcome challenges in settings. So it's kind of using this knowledge really now and making it relevant to how this influences inclusion. So I just put some ideas here just to think about in a minute, really, is things like, this idea more recently of trying to promote more mastery orientated challenges and qualities in practice. So obviously looking at the fact that we're trying, aren't we, now more than ever to make sure individuals and learners are focused on learning as much as possible by overcoming these challenges through hard work. So it's kind of thinking about now, like, mastery goals really in settings, and how this can sort of influence our thinking really for inclusion. Trying to promote learners to no longer be afraid to try and overcome challenges. And in fact, now this idea of trying to promote the idea that hopefully more learners will enjoy and almost seek challenge now in practice. So, in order to be quite inclusive and, kind of coming away from, like Megan was talking about in relation to like the medical model approach, where we've been very much kind of looking at individuals by their needs, but trying to push more now into more holistic views of this, and, how these sort of practices, can be very inclusive of all different needs, and obviously more universal types of approaches, as well as targeted provision. Also thinking about, the metacognition and self-regulation in practice. So massively that idea of the skills that help learning, and how we promote them ourselves to include everyone, make things as inclusive as possible. And I was reading recently, with the Education Endowment Foundation, and their research is coming out on average about 7 months plus, the impact is about 7 months more of a child's age. And it's obviously really quite has very little cost really for the setting in trying to promote these types of skills. So, and very much thinking like quite holistically with different additional needs, and how actually by sort of providing those foundations for learning, how that's going to help these more inclusive activities and learning opportunities really. Thinking about things like, as educators and teachers, how do we model our own thinking skills, how we, very much now about trying to sort of promote that everyone has to, overcome challenges, and that basically learning is like this never-ending process. Self-regulation, the idea that, if you give someone a fish that day, they'll eat that day, whereas if you teach them how to fish, they'll never go hungry, type of thing. So obviously the idea is trying to provide now a lot more like learning opportunities to reflect on learning, obviously look at like different areas of development, how they're going to achieve them. Sort of those aspects of these mindsets really. And lastly, just as you've just been discussing in detail then, and from what Megan's gone through with you just then, just think about this idea, how everybody's brain is different, and that the idea of neuroplasticity is the idea that the more and more that that we can provide these learning opportunities, and we now know that the brain will become stronger, and learners can progress. So even if you think about a lot of holistic different additional needs, this is really quite an interesting concept really in relation to how this influences our practice to make sure that everyone has the same sort of learning opportunities, and rather than kind of segregating different levels of ability and things like that at times. And I just put there just to remind you really that a lot of Carol Dweck's work that you've been reading about, she's very much about the fact that a person's true potential is unknown and unknowable. So it's kind of thinking that in the back of our minds really as educators, as teachers, and thinking about the fact that if we think about that, then how can we just we can't almost limit opportunities for additional learning needs in our settings. So sorry, the screen's just frozen. Okay, so thinking about that then in relation to substrand 3, is thinking about, so all these sort of qualities that we look at in relation to promoting a growth mindset also looks then at this idea of promoting resilience, so making the link between the two. So the reading that you looked at was from Yeager and Dweck in 2010, and I've just drawn together here really a few of kind of like the big findings really, and what they're saying within this research really within the literature is that students who believe or are taught, so by educators, by teachers, in settings, their intellectual abilities are qualities, so actually qualities that they, that they can learn, they can adapt, they can sometimes, they can set targets for, and that they can then obviously look at potentially having higher achievement in the setting. And also within this literature, a lot of this looked at, this idea of believing or being taught that social attributes can be developed and that they can actually lower then things like, adolescents' aggression and stress in response to things like peer victimization or exclusion, and as a result can enhance then school performance. So it's kind of given us a lot of evidence there to suggest that if we can, promote this sort of growth mindset, that grit, that resilience, then hopefully in the right sort of inclusive practices, this should help include in a bit more of a, a holistic, more universal approach. So just to finish off this morning session now, I'm going to leave you with just like one last task in your groups to have a little look at. So now thinking about growth mindset and resilience together, and thinking about within your own practice then, for sub-strand 3, thinking about what you've read on the Pebble Pad, the things that you've engaged with within the session so far, what Megan's gone through a little bit as well, we'll link to this. But thinking about now the role of growth mindset and resilience then, and then what sort of influence that has within the education settings for learners with and without ALM though. So if we're trying to promote this more, at times, more universal provision, then how could we balance that as well? Discuss maybe evaluating the role of growth mindset and resilience to have them within a whole school approach. So thinking about how, on a whole school sort of inclusion approach, how does this look? And think about your own settings. Maybe you're already doing quite a lot of this already, but it'd be really interesting to feed some information back. And like Megan keeps reminding you, really just pop it in the chat as well if you've got some ideas that you want to share. So then think about, obviously, like I've put here, the notes from the Pebble Pad, and then obviously, like I'm just reminding you, really just share any good examples of practice that you might have. Okay, so I'll just stop sharing for a moment then.